always thought growing old would bring peace. Turns out it just makes people think you're easy to ignore. My name is Howard Briggs. I'm 71 years old, widower, veteran. And until recently, I believed I raised a decent family. 3 kids. 2 boys, 1 girl. Gave them everything I never had growing up. Time, love, stability. Turns out none of that matters when you're just the old man at the table. Sit back and let me tell you how I lost everything, and how I took it all back. Before we get too far, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Christmas used to mean something around here. The warmth of a full house, the smell of rosemary ham, laughter echoing through the halls I built with my own hands. But this year, something was off from the start. The decorations were up, sure, but it felt staged, like a set waiting for actors. The hugs were polite, the smiles paper-thin. We sat down to dinner, my favorite meal of the year, and before I could take the first bite, my eldest, Jacob, cleared his throat. He pulled out a folder. "I want to talk about something important," he said, looking around the table like a damn CEO. My youngest, Claire, gave a little nod. Daniel avoided my eyes. Jacob slid the folder in front of me. "It's just paperwork, Dad. Standard stuff." I opened it. Read the header. Voluntary consent for residential care transition. A nursing home. They wanted me to sign myself into a nursing home. "It's not what it looks like," Claire said too quickly. Jacob leaned in. "We've looked at the best places. You'll have company. Activities, 24-hour medical staff." I said nothing. They mistook my silence for confusion. "It's just easier for everyone," Jacob added, like he was offering a solution instead of a sentence. Daniel stayed quiet. I looked down at the paper again. A blank line for my signature, just above a pre-filled date. Today's date. They'd already decided. I folded the document slowly, placed it back on the table. Then I smiled. "Of course," I said. "I trust you all. If this is what you think is best, then okay." Relief washed over their faces like I'd just handed them keys to freedom. But inside, something cracked. Something deep. Something final. They thought I was old and slow, a burden, a problem to be managed quietly, like a leaky faucet or a weak fuse. But I still had eyes, I still had ears, and more importantly, I had time. After that Christmas dinner, I didn't argue, I didn't shout, I didn't cry. That was their way, not mine. I smiled the way old men smile when everyone thinks they're being agreeable. I nodded. I even made a joke about the food being too dry, which got a forced laugh out of Jacob. But in my mind, something had split, not a crack, a clean break. They thought I signed that paper. I didn't. The copy they kept was a decoy I printed off the internet myself. The real one never left its envelope. The next day, I started moving money, quietly, slowly, like a man checking the weather before a storm. I logged into every account they didn't know about. Sold the old stocks I'd held onto for decades. Canceled the joint savings they helped me set up for my own good. Transferred the house into a trust I'd set up years ago just in case. Turns out, just in case finally came. By New Year's, I was a ghost. Not missing. Just unreachable. No more texts. No more calls. Just silence. I made sure the lights still came on in the house. The lawn stayed trimmed. I paid a neighbor's kid to keep up appearances. Let him think I was inside watching Wheel of Fortune reruns. Meanwhile, I was in a cabin upstate. No Wi-Fi. No cell signal. Just a landline and the radio. I read old books, chopped my own firewood, and kept a notebook of everything I remembered about that night. Who said what? Who looked away? Who didn't flinch? People think revenge needs shouting and broken dishes. But sometimes it just needs a man with a steady hand and a long memory. When the estate lawyer called in February, I answered with a different name, a name I hadn't used since the war. I told him I wanted to move everything, what little they hadn't already tried to get their hands on, into a new foundation, one with very clear rules. No distributions, no family claims, educational purposes only. He paused. "Are you sure you want to lock out your children, mister?" I finished his sentence. Absolutely. I didn't sleep much that night. After the dishes were cleared, the gifts exchanged, and the forced smiles faded into cold goodbyes, I sat alone in my chair by the window, staring out at the snow. The house was too quiet. You'd think, after raising 3 kids here, after decades of laughter, arguments, birthdays, scraped knees, and graduation photos, the walls would hold on to some of that noise. But no, silence has a way of feeling loud when you're the only one left to hear it. Their words rang in my head. It's easier for everyone. That's what Jacob had said. Calm, collected, like he was making a business decision. Not like he was asking his father to disappear. Dad, come on, don't make this harder than it has to be. And Emily, her hand resting on my arm like she was comforting a patient, not a parent. It's not that we don't love you, she said. It's just, this is what makes sense now. What made sense? They'd already picked the place. Had the brochures printed. Lakewood Living. Sounded more like a hotel than a care facility. I'd seen the glossy images. Smiling gray-haired folks playing checkers. Walking gardens in slow motion. A nurse in every frame. But they didn't show you the locked doors or the schedules or the quiet look in someone's eyes when they realize they've been parked at the end of their story. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't done. And I damn sure wasn't going to let my life be packaged, signed, and filed away by my own children. That night, while the lights from the neighbor's decorations blinked through the frost on my window, I opened my desk drawer. I didn't take out the consent form. I pulled out something older, my old banking binder, yellowed tabs, faint ink, years of savings, pension transfers, land deeds, every record, every detail. I flipped through each page like I was turning back time, back to when I made decisions for myself, back to when I signed forms for the future, not for surrender. The next morning, before the sun came up, I made calls. To the bank manager I used to work with, to a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in 10 years, to the one friend I still had at the county office. And then I packed a single bag. No one noticed when I left, because no one checked in. They thought I was already gone, just a signature away from being someone else's responsibility. But they forgot who raised them. They forgot I built this house with my own 2 hands. They forgot I didn't get this far in life by letting someone else write my ending. Let 'em think I signed it. Let 'em think I agreed. They'd learn soon enough. For the next few weeks I became a ghost. Not the kind that haunts, but the kind that watches quietly from the edges. I kept my phone off. No social media. No email. The world they lived in moved too fast, too loud, too shallow. I needed distance. I rented a tiny cabin 3 towns over, off-grid mostly. Just a wood stove, a coffee pot, and my thoughts. I told no one. Not even Hank, my old friend from the VFW. This wasn't the kind of silence you shared. In that quiet, I made moves. I wasn't just vanishing, I was building. First, I met with the estate lawyer. We drafted new documents. I didn't want the house, or the savings, or the land tied to anyone. I wanted clarity. Control. The lawyer raised an eyebrow when I told him my intentions, but I could see the shift in his eyes, the respect, maybe even admiration. Then came the bank accounts. I moved every cent into a foundation under a neutral name. Not traceable, not visible. The kids would search one day, thinking they could flip through statements and find the same predictable trail I'd always left. They'd find nothing. I sold the car. Bought an older pickup. No GPS, no frills. It ran like hell, but it was mine. I kept the plates off record. No digital leash. And the land. Oh, the land. I still owned the adjacent lot behind the house. 5 acres of woods and overgrown brush they'd never bothered with. I'd bought it back in, '87 when the neighbor passed, and no one wanted it. They always joked about how it was Dad's little wild patch. They never knew I kept the deed separate on purpose. I walked that land every morning, snow up to my knees, breath hanging in the air. I walked it until my legs burned and my thoughts settled. And that's where I made my plan. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't write angry letters or call them sobbing. No lectures, no guilt trips. I'd learned something over the years. Real revenge isn't loud. It's patient, quiet. It doesn't beg to be understood. It simply arrives. One evening, I stood at the edge of the tree line and stared at my house. Well, what used to be mine. The curtains were closed. Lights off, except in the upstairs hallway. I imagined Jacob in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone while waiting for the microwave to beep. Emily probably asleep early, headphones in, escaping into some audiobook about mindfulness. I could have walked up, knocked, asked them how they were enjoying Lakewood living without me, but not yet. It wasn't time. They hadn't lost anything yet. Not really. They thought they'd won, that they'd gently nudged the old man toward the sunset and moved on. But I was still here, still watching. And the real story? It hadn't even started yet. Spring came slow that year. The snow melted in patches like wounds healing out of order. I waited. Let them settle in. Let them repaint the walls and move their furniture in. Let them think they owned the place in more than name. Meanwhile, I met with a man named Curtis, a quiet realtor with a handshake like cold stone and eyes that didn't blink too much. He specialized in sealed bids and discretion. I don't want to sign out front, no listing on the usual sites. I told him this is a private matter. Curtis nodded. Understood. You want them to think no one's interested, then show up last. I liked him instantly. We filed the paperwork. The house, my house, would go on silent auction. Jacob, of course, would be the one to approve the sale. Emily might protest, but he'd spin it. Too many memories, he'd say. Let's move forward. They didn't live in that house like it was sacred. They treated it like a stepping stone, a piece of leverage. They just didn't know someone else was in the game. Me. By the time the auction was announced, Curtis had already gathered a short list of interested parties. A silent war, played with envelopes and bank letters. I submitted my bid last. Not under my name, of course. I used the foundation. A clean name, no history, no emotion attached. The bid? $1 over Jacob's highest acceptable offer. Just enough to win. Just enough to make him regret not asking more. 2 weeks later, the call came. Curtis sounded almost amused. They signed. You're the new owner, Frank. I didn't say anything, just nodded, standing on the porch of the cabin, the wind blowing like applause through the trees. I didn't go back right away. Let them pack. Let them believe they'd done the right thing. Let them celebrate their clean exit. I wanted the space empty when I returned. I wanted my footsteps to be the only ones on those floors for the first time in months. When I finally pulled up in the truck, the driveway was bare. The welcome mat was gone, no signs of life, just the house, plain and silent, like it had been waiting for me. I unlocked the door, stepped inside. It smelled like lemon cleaner and lost time. I walked room to room. They'd left the place hollow, but they couldn't erase the feeling. The memories held onto the corners like dust. And upstairs, in what used to be my bedroom, was a single note taped to the mirror. Thanks for everything, Dad. I stared at it for a long while. Not because I was touched, but because it proved one thing. They still believed I'd been moved out of the way. Good. Let them. I didn't touch the note. I left it where it was, like a museum exhibit, a reminder of what they thought they'd done. And now it was time for me to do what I came to do. The first week back, I said nothing to anyone. I drove into town, bought groceries like a ghost, walked the aisles, nodded politely, answered questions with small smiles and smaller words. Everyone assumed I'd just been gone for a while. Nobody asked why. Nobody knew about the paperwork, the foundation, the shell of a story I'd left behind. I liked it that way. But Jacob, he didn't like silence. 2 weeks in, he showed up. I was out back, replacing a piece of fence panel that had rotted at the base. I heard the tires before I saw the car, a newer SUV. Clean, smug-looking. He slammed the door harder than he had to. Dad? I kept hammering, one nail, then another, then I turned. Didn't expect to see you, I said. He looked around, confused. I thought this place was sold. It was. To who? To someone who cared enough to take it back. His brow furrowed, then flattened, anger rising behind his eyes. You bought it? No, the foundation did. He scoffed. You made us think you were gone. You faked your disappearance. I shrugged. You told me to sign something. I signed something. Thought we were all making big decisions. You lied. I wiped my hands on my jeans. You first. There was a silence then. The kind that makes the birds stop singing. The kind where even the trees lean in. Jacob stepped forward, face tight. You can't just play God with property. We had plans. Emily, she was already looking at lots in Denver. You'll manage, I said, just like I did, alone. You manipulated the entire sale. I followed the rules. I submitted a bid. I outbid you. That's business, isn't it? I smiled. Or does it only count when it benefits you? He didn't answer. He just stood there, stunned, choking on a reality he hadn't prepared for. I let the silence sit. Then I turned back to the fence. Good seeing you, son. Don't forget to call ahead next time. 3 months passed. I didn't see Jacob again. Didn't see Emily, didn't get a letter, not even a voicemail. Fine by me. I had work to do. The land wasn't just land anymore. It was memory. And memory needed care. I cleared out the old shed, turned it into a small workshop. Started collecting photos. Old family pictures, my father's tools, my mother's recipe cards. Pieces of the past that still meant something. I labeled them, mounted them. Hung them in frames with brass plates that read, "This is where it began." Visitors started to come. First the mayor, then the historical society, then a group of school kids on a local history field trip. They asked questions, I told stories, some true, some shaped to teach something. They called it a community archive. I called it justice. Because every time someone walked in and saw what we'd built, what had been preserved, I could feel the balance tipping back in my favor. The old man they tried to erase was now the story they couldn't avoid. It was late September when I got the letter. Typed. Formal, no return address. To Mr. Frank Holloway, we hereby inform you that your actions concerning the transfer of property to a private foundation are being reviewed. A complaint has been filed by a former family member asserting coercion and fraudulent concealment. I laughed. Then I set the letter down, poured myself a glass of bourbon, and watched the sunset from the porch. They still didn't get it. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about the land. It was about remembrance. They'd tried to bury me under the weight of convenience, of guilt, of shame. And now? Now they'd have to tell everyone the land they thought they inherited was a living tribute. To me. Winter came early that year. The trees held onto their last leaves like they knew something was coming, and the wind had a bite to it that felt personal. I spent most of December preparing the community center for its first winter exhibit. Photos, timelines, personal notes, everything placed by hand. People came. Happy, some out of curiosity, some out of guilt. There were names in the guest book I recognized, neighbors who'd sat at our dinner table, people who once called me Frank but now called me Mr. Holloway. I let them. It wasn't about vanity. It was about control. For the first time in a long time, I had it. Christmas Eve arrived like a ghost dragging old chains. I didn't decorate, didn't hang a wreath. But I did pull out the old dining table and set it for one. I lit a single candle, poured a glass of wine, and sat at the head. Across from me, I placed a folded napkin, a plate, a chair turned slightly to the right, how Marion used to sit. I closed my eyes and listened. No forks clinking, no laughter, no forced cheer. Just wind brushing past the windows and the slow creak of a house remembering. It should have been lonely, but it wasn't, because I knew something they didn't. This dinner wasn't empty. It was waiting. On December 27th, Jacob showed up again. He didn't knock this time, just opened the door and stood in the entry like he still had a right to. "You've made your point," he said. I looked up from my chair, didn't stand, didn't invite him in. "Did I?" "Yes," he snapped. "You embarrassed us. You manipulated the sale. You—" "Stop," I said. He blinked. I stood slowly, walked to the sideboard, picked up a manila envelope. "I knew you'd come back," I said, "so I prepared something." I handed it to him. He opened it, expecting, I don't know, maybe a deed, maybe an apology. Instead, it was a timeline. A printed outline of the Foundation's creation, date-stamped. Transaction records. Notarized letters from the lawyer I'd hired months before Christmas dinner. "You think this is about revenge," I said, "but it's not." He looked up, confused. "It's about memory, Jacob, about legacy. You wanted to bury me in some home and sell the land for square footage and quartz countertops." I stepped closer. "I wanted to remind you who built all of this." He stayed quiet, eyes scanning the documents. "You can't win," he finally said. "I already have." He looked up, face hardening. "You're alone." I smiled. "No, Jacob. I'm free. There's a difference." The next few weeks passed in quiet repetition. Mornings started early, with black coffee and local news on mute. I walked the grounds, checked the plaques, made sure the snow was shoveled before it froze into ice. I swept the porch steps twice a day, even when no one was coming. It wasn't about visitors. It was about keeping the place alive. That house had once held my marriage, my children's first words, my late-night repairs when things broke and no one else noticed. And now, it stood not for them, but because of them. Funny how time has a way of flipping meaning on its head. Sometimes people would ask me why I didn't just sell everything and disappear. "Why stay in a town that turned its back on you?" one neighbor said. But they didn't understand. It wasn't about the town. It was about presence, about making them see me. Not on a porch in a rocking chair, not through a nursing home window, but here, on my feet, breathing their air, watching their eyes avoid mine in the grocery store aisle. Shame is a strange currency. You can't spend it, but you sure as hell can collect it. And I was getting rich. One afternoon, in mid-January, I received a letter. Handwritten. From Nathan. Not an apology, heaven forbid, but a question. He wanted to know how I'd done it. How I managed to flip the deed and who had helped. Helped. As if this had been a group effort. As if the world had conspired to humble him. The irony made me laugh. But I didn't respond. Some questions don't deserve answers. Some wounds are meant to stay raw. A few days later, Sarah showed up. She didn't come to talk. She came to look. I saw her outside, parked at the edge of the property, just sitting there. Window cracked, eyes staring toward the front porch like she expected it to yell at her. She didn't get out. Didn't call. Just sat in her shiny SUV for 23 minutes. Then left. I timed it. The center hosted its first community meal in February. Not a grand event. Just stew, bread, and stories. I told them about the blizzard of '82, when the power went out for 3 days. About the time Nathan broke his leg, and I carried him down the mountain on foot. About how Sarah used to sneak cookies under the table when she thought I wasn't looking. I didn't speak with bitterness. I spoke like a historian, because that's what I was now. The last living witness to what really happened in that house. The town began to shift. Whispers turned into nods. Nods turned into conversations. And one by one, people stopped seeing me as the man who was put away, and started seeing me as the man who stayed. Who endured. Who redefined the map they thought they knew. But I still hadn't done what I came to do. That part was coming. slowly. But surely. By the time March rolled in, the letters stopped. The last one came from Jacob. It wasn't kind, but it wasn't cruel either. Just confused. "How could you do this to your own children?" he wrote. I stared at that line for a long while. I almost felt something. Almost. But then I remembered the Christmas dinner, the way they smiled like they were helping me, the way they pushed the pen toward my fingers, already convinced I'd sign. And I realized they still didn't understand. They thought this was about money. It wasn't. It was about dignity. I never planned to build a legacy. But it happened anyway. More people came to the community house. Some for the meals, some for the stories. Others just wanted warmth, both kinds. They brought photographs, memories. One woman brought a box of VHS tapes from a nearby church that had burned down. "Thought you might know someone who could use these," she said. I did. Everyone could. The town council sent a formal invite to speak at Heritage Day. I declined. Not because I was bitter, but because I wasn't finished yet. The story wasn't ready. The ending still had to land. April was when things started to shake. Sarah tried to access one of the old accounts, joint savings, only to find it closed. A lawyer from the family firm called the community house asked for me by name. The volunteer who answered said, "He's not available. Can I take a message?" I was in the garden, planting tulips. I had time. I didn't hide anything. Every transaction had been legal. Every title change documented. Every asset moved carefully, methodically, one by one, into the foundation. A foundation named not after me, but after the name of the street my children had grown up on, Brentwood Legacy Foundation. They always loved that name. Now they'd see it on donation receipts, tax records, and event flyers for the rest of their lives. Poetic, really. In May, the storm finally came. I was sitting on the porch when Jacob showed up. He didn't knock, just walked right up the steps like it was still his place. His face was red. Hands shaking. "You stole our future." I looked at him for a long while, and then, calmly, I said, "No, I took back mine." He didn't yell after that. Didn't slam the door when he left. He just stood there, staring at the house like he'd never seen it before. Like it didn't belong to him anymore. Because it didn't. The rest of May passed without a word. No visits. No phone calls. Not even a text. Silence had its own gravity, and I let it sit. Because I knew what was coming next. By early June, the letters came again, this time not handwritten. Official documents, legal notices. A petition for clarification of assets. Their lawyer had realized what I'd done, and now they wanted it undone. But it was too late. The clock had already run its course. The foundation wasn't just a name on paper anymore. It was real. It had funding. It had a board. It had a mission. And most importantly, it had protection. I hired a lawyer, of course. Not to fight. Just to keep everything clean. She was sharp, young, ruthless in the best way. When she read the file, she looked up at me and said, "This is airtight." I nodded. It wasn't revenge, I told her. She smiled. Of course not. But we both knew better. The funny thing is, they never asked why. Not once. Not even Sarah. She'd always been the emotional one, the connector. But even she was silent now. Maybe because, deep down, she remembered how they pushed that pen toward me that night. Maybe she saw what I saw, that look in their eyes. They weren't asking me to sign. They were telling me. I think what hurt the most was the speed. It didn't take months or years to discard me. It took one dinner, one moment, One shared glance between siblings and a paper slid across the table. No one fought for me. No one paused. Not even to say, "Dad, are you okay?" So I stopped asking myself whether they deserved a second chance. Because they'd already had a first one. And they wasted it. By July, the town had fully embraced the foundation. We started weekly story nights. People would come and share memories. Veterans, single mothers, even teenagers. They all had stories. I didn't always speak. Sometimes I just listened. And that was enough. One night, after a story about a boy who lost everything in a house fire, an old man came up to me. "You built something good here," he said. I smiled. "No, I just gave it a name." He clapped my shoulder. "That's what fathers do." And I swear, that hit harder than anything my real children had said in years. Late that summer, the foundation held its first community meal. Over 200 people showed up. I sat in the back, watching from a distance. No speeches, no attention, just faces, warmth, laughter, and somewhere deep in the noise, a quiet voice in my head whispered, "You're home." August brought something I hadn't planned for. A letter, handwritten, from Jacob. Just a single page. No greeting, no apologies. Just, "I don't know what you're trying to prove, but this stunt, this performance, isn't noble. It's petty. You've embarrassed us, undermined everything we worked for. You'll regret this. Jacob." I folded it twice and dropped it in the fireplace. No flames. Just ash. 2 days later, a different letter came. This one from Sarah. Typed, but softer. "Dad, I don't understand. I really don't. I know we hurt you. I know that night changed everything. But you could have talked to me. You could have told me something. Please tell me what this is. Please don't shut me out." That one, I didn't burn. I placed it in a drawer beside my old wedding band. Some things, even silence, can't erase. By September, the pressure shifted. Lawyers began to dig deeper. Jacob tried to file an emergency injunction, claimed undue influence, mental instability. Didn't work. Too clean. Too late. Too quiet. The newspapers caught on. Retired builder turns family estate into community home. Local father's final gift leaves kids with nothing. I didn't read the articles, but I heard the whispers. Some called me cruel. Others called me brave. The truth? I wasn't either. I was just a man who'd been left at the table one Christmas night and decided never to sit there again. Then came the final blow. Jacob filed to sell the land behind the house. The plot we used to call the garden. Wanted to level it, build townhomes. Said it would revitalize the area. I didn't flinch, because I had something he didn't. Time. 3 weeks later, I made one phone call. Just one. To the County Preservation Board. I gave them a name. And a date. And the location. That's all it took. You see, 20 years ago, while digging in the backyard, I'd found something. Old pottery. Buried bricks. A circular pattern beneath the soil. I'd taken photos. Called a friend at the college. They said it looked like remnants of an old settlement, pre-Civil War, maybe older. I'd forgotten all about it, but not anymore. An inspection was ordered. The construction was halted, and within days, the entire land was reclassified. Historical. Untouchable. Jacob tried everything. Appeals. Protests. But the board held firm. The papers ran new headlines. Family land declared protected zone after shocking discovery. Elderly man blocks son's luxury project with historical claim. I didn't smile. Not exactly. But when I walked past the property and saw that bright red tape stretched across the fence, I paused. Just for a second. Balk. and breathed. October crept in with cold mornings and silent trees. The house stood taller somehow, prouder, like it remembered who built it. Then one rainy Thursday the call came. From Sarah. Her voice trembled. "Dad, Jacob says you're gone." I didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew what came next. By mid-November, word had spread. Rumors, mostly. I'd moved. I'd died. I'd lost my mind. None were true. But I let them grow. Because sometimes silence is louder than explanation. The kids didn't show up all at once. They trickled in. First, Jacob, storming down the old gravel path with a suit and a suitcase. Then Sarah, softer, more hesitant, pulling into the driveway like she wasn't sure she belonged anymore. And finally, Ethan, quiet as always, but this time, his eyes didn't meet mine. They stood in front of the door like strangers. The same door they once slammed as teenagers. The same porch where we carved pumpkins, hung lights, took family photos. But now, just wood and distance. Jacob reached for his key first. Didn't fit. He jiggled it, forced it, then scowled. "This is ridiculous. Why would you change the locks?" I stayed quiet. Sarah tried hers. No luck. She looked up at the window, eyes already glassy. "Dad?" That's when she noticed it. A white envelope taped to the front door. Neat. Centered. Addressed only with one word. Family. Sarah took it down, opened it slowly, and read aloud. "If you're reading this, it means I've already let go. Of the house. Of the land. Of all of it. You'll find nothing inside. No heirlooms, no accounts, no savings. Everything has been donated to people who never asked me to disappear. To people who didn't hand me a pen and say, 'Sign this, Dad, it's easier for everyone.' You didn't lose a father. You gave one away. And for that, I've built something better. A place that will outlive all of us. Dad." Jacob turned pale. Sarah sat down on the porch step. "Ethan?" He just whispered, "What did we do?" They searched the whole house. Of course they did. Every cabinet. Every drawer. But it was true. Empty. No clothes. No furniture. No will. Just a plaque on the front room wall, engraved with one sentence. Dedicated to the ones who stay when it's hard. But the final twist? That hadn't landed yet. And it would. Oh, it would. Just not here. 3 weeks passed. They kept coming back, circling the house like ghosts haunting their own mistakes. Jacob tried contacting lawyers. Sarah checked the hospital records. Ethan wrote me a letter. None of them got a response. Not because I hated them, because I needed them to feel it. The stillness, the silence, the space their choices carved into my life. It was Sarah who first saw the sign. A small wooden board nailed to the community board outside the post office. Coming soon, the Briggs Center for Quiet Resilience. Honoring the unheard. Opening winter. Her hand shook when she took a photo of it. When she sent it to the group chat, Jacob replied with a single word. "What?" The following week, the local paper ran a story. Front page. My picture, smiling, wearing that old plaid jacket they hated. The headline, "Retired builder converts entire estate into community sanctuary. After a lifetime of giving, he builds one final gift." It went viral in town, not because people loved me, but because they remembered me, the man who fixed fences for free, who shoveled the neighbor's walk even after surgery, who coached Little League after work. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible. I was a story. The house? Now stripped down and rebuilt from its bones. Rooms converted into reading nooks. The kitchen? A communal meal center. My old study? A space for young dads who feel lost. Even my tools, displayed on a wall like relics of something sacred. They didn't see money when they entered. They saw life. And for the first time, so did I. The kids showed up at the opening ceremony. I didn't invite them. Didn't need to. Curiosity, guilt, and pride dragged them there. They stood in the back, unnoticed by the crowd, until a volunteer offered them seats in the front row. They declined. They knew they didn't belong there, not today. A young girl stepped on stage, maybe 10. Dark curls, nervous smile. "Mr. Briggs taught me how to sand wood," she said into the mic, "and how to make birdhouses. But mostly, he taught me that not all grandpas leave." The room went silent. Even the air paused. And then the applause started, soft, then thunderous. Jacob didn't clap. Sarah did. Ethan wiped his eyes. And when the ribbon was cut and the plaque revealed, it read, "For those told they weren't needed, you are. For those handed pens instead of love, you still matter. And for those forgotten at Christmas, this is your home now." I never turned to look at them. Didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't need words. Some revenge doesn't need rage. Sometimes peace isn't forgiveness. It's reclaiming your name without ever raising your voice. The ribbon had barely fluttered to the ground when I walked away. No cameras, no speeches, just me and the cold wind down an empty side street. I didn't need to stay. My part was done. The center would speak for me now. The next day, they tried to visit again. Not as guests, but as heirs. They still thought it was all for show. That maybe I'd forgive them if they cried enough. That maybe it wasn't too late to reconnect. Jacob knocked on the old front door. A volunteer in a bright blue vest answered. "Is Mr. Briggs here?" he asked. The volunteer tilted his head. "You mean Howard?" "Yes, I'm his son." The pause was long, too long. "I'm sorry," the volunteer said. "Mr. Briggs passed away months ago." Sarah gasped. Ethan whispered, "What?" Jacob frowned. No, he didn't. We saw him last week." The volunteer smiled sadly. "No, sir. Howard Briggs passed away the moment his family signed him over to strangers. The man you're talking about is someone new." And then he gently shut the door. They stood there, frozen, like statues of guilt carved into concrete. No keys, no welcome, no inheritance, just the wind and the shame. Back at their hotel, they tried to log into my bank accounts. Nothing. Tried the lawyer I used for estate planning. Disconnected. Ethan drove by the town hall and asked for property records. The clerk pulled up the deeds. Briggs Farm, no longer owned by Howard Briggs. Now under the Briggs Foundation for Community Restoration. Filed and finalized 2 months prior. Irrevocable. Untouchable. Unapologetic. They booked an earlier flight home. Didn't speak on the way to the airport. Didn't sit together on the plane. Only when the seatbelt sign came on did Sarah whisper, "We really lost him." But they didn't just lose me. They lost everything I built. Because they couldn't sit through one dinner without turning it into a power play. Because they forgot the cost of betrayal isn't always paid in dollars. Sometimes it's paid in names that disappear from deeds, and in doors that never open again. I didn't leave a will. I left a letter. One each. All handwritten. All sealed in identical brown envelopes. They arrived 1 week after the community center opened. Jacob opened his first. Inside, one sentence. "You taught me what silence sounds like. I built a place to fill it." Sarah's read, "You served me judgment instead of dinner. I served it back, but colder." And Ethan's, "You were the quietest that night, but I heard it loudest in you." None of them responded. None of them dared. But the townspeople did. They came in droves. To sit. To talk. To rebuild. Young men who'd lost fathers. Fathers who'd lost sons. People who knew the quiet kind of pain that doesn't scream. It waits. And now they had a place to bring it. Because I made sure of it. The land that raised my children now raised strangers who needed it more. The house they tried to bury me in, now a sanctuary for those trying to stay alive. And the name they erased from their futures, now etched into a plaque that can never be removed. You don't get to sell a man's story and still expect to write the ending. I wrote my own. With hammer, nail, and the one thing they never saw coming. A legacy built from quiet revenge. Sarah tried to contact the center. She left voicemails. She sent an email to the foundation's address. She even mailed a letter, handwritten, desperate, polite. She signed it, "Your daughter, always." The letter was never returned, nor was it answered. It was filed away in a box labeled Correspondence Post-Closure. Ethan searched the foundation's website, hoping for a clue, a contact name, a back door. But all he found was a single sentence under the About Us section. Built on forgotten promises, powered by unspoken truth. And below that, a photo. Black and white. Howard Briggs, standing in front of the old house, alone. Jacob, ever the problem solver, tried lawyers. Tried was the right word. He challenged the deed transfers. Claimed coercion. Alleged mental decline. Said Howard had been manipulated. That the foundation must have tricked him. The court reviewed the documents. Meticulous. Signed. Dated. Witnessed. Howard wasn't coerced, he was clear. Clearer than he had been in years. The judge dismissed the petition. Mr. Briggs, he told Jacob, was not robbed. He made a choice. The press got wind. A local paper ran a story. Family learns late, town's newest hero left legacy, not inheritance. The comments were brutal. Good for him. Too many kids feel entitled. He chose the people who actually cared. The last one stung. Because it was true. At work, Jacob started hearing whispers. "Isn't that the guy whose dad gave it all away? Heard he got disowned at Christmas dinner." It followed him. Not loud, but steady. Like footsteps in a hallway when you're the only one there. Sarah tried to deflect. She threw herself into volunteer work, tried to reclaim the image of a good daughter. But even she couldn't escape it. Every fundraiser, every community event, every handshake ended with someone saying, "Oh, you're his daughter. What a powerful story. He must have been such a strong man." She would smile, numb. "Yes," she'd say, "he really was." Ethan moved abroad. Said he needed a fresh start. But fresh starts don't scrub shame. They just relocated. He kept the letter in a drawer. Read it once every few weeks. Folded it neatly. Hoped maybe it would read differently one day. It never did. The center, meanwhile, thrived. Not in grandeur, but in soul. Workshops were hosted in the old living room. Grief circles in the barn. Gardening classes in what used to be the backyard. They left the porch light on at night, just like Howard always had. Not for family, but for strangers trying to find their way home. A year passed. Then two. None of them came back. None of them were invited. But every December, on Christmas Eve, a small card appeared on the center's front step. No name. No return address. Just a drawing of a house, with the porch light on. and one line. We remember, and we understand. But understanding comes late. Regret comes later. Forgiveness? That never came at all. The community center's opening was quiet. No grand speeches. No ribbon cutting. No catered dinner. Just an open door. A small wooden sign carved by hand. This place belongs to those who've been forgotten. The first visitors were strangers. Then neighbors. Then strangers who became neighbors. People who'd lost family. People who had no family. People who just needed somewhere to sit and not explain why they were crying. The living room still had the same fireplace. They didn't repaint it. They left the scuff marks from Howard's old rocking chair on the floorboards. They even framed the original house deed, unsigned, untransferred, in a glass case with a small plaque. This could have gone to blood, but it went to truth. In a box under the counter, there was a collection of stories. Handwritten, typed, sometimes just a few words on napkins. Stories of betrayal, of survival, of starting again at 72. Howard had started the collection. He called it the Shelf of Second Chances. Sarah visited once. Not officially. She parked 3 streets away, walked past the building twice, stood on the other side of the road with her coat pulled tight, just watching. She saw a young boy run out laughing, holding a wooden birdhouse he had just painted. She saw a woman with a cane carrying a bag of groceries, helped by 2 volunteers. She saw the porch light, still on, even at noon. She didn't go inside. She didn't think she was allowed. Jacob didn't visit. He wrote a letter, though. Typed, formal, cold. Requested a family reconciliation discussion. Asked for a partial redirection of assets to cover intergenerational misunderstandings. The Foundation sent a reply. Short, polite, unforgiving. There is no misunderstanding, only memory, and memory cannot be redirected. He didn't write again. Ethan mailed a book. No return address. Just a bookmark inside, pointing to a quote. You don't inherit a name, you live it. Howard's name was on the spine of the Foundation's quarterly journal now. He didn't need a tombstone. The house stayed warm. The garden grew wilder. The place was full of life. And not 1 inch of it belonged to his children. One afternoon, the center hosted a talk titled, Legacy Isn't DNA. People came from towns over. They shared stories of fathers who left, mothers who vanished, siblings who betrayed them for bank accounts. They weren't there for therapy. They were there for witness. To know someone else understood the burn of being forgotten and the fire that came after. At the front of the room, an old recording played on a loop. Howard's voice. Grainy, soft. People think revenge is about taking something back, but it's not. It's about giving something away that they can never reclaim. One of the volunteers pressed pause, turned to the group. Do you think he meant the house? Someone asked. The volunteer shook her head. No, she said. I think he meant peace. Before the transfer ever happened, before the building permit was even filed, Howard had begun preparing. It started with a man named Carl Bennett. Carl was the county's oldest active notary, a Vietnam vet with a limp and a memory like steel. Howard had helped him install a new furnace during a freak snowstorm 5 years earlier. No charge, just neighborly duty. Carl never forgot. So when Howard came by, calm and quiet, with a sealed envelope and a single sentence, I need this witnessed but not opened, Carl didn't ask questions. He just nodded and said, understood. Then came the trip to the assessor's office. Howard, who hadn't driven more than 20 minutes in a decade, took a bus 2 towns over to avoid local gossip. Walked into the office wearing a borrowed coat and wire-rimmed glasses, said he was helping a friend with land classification. Asked questions, listened more. What he learned was simple but powerful. If a property was to be designated for public historical preservation based on legacy or cultural impact, it could not be sold, claimed, inherited, or reassigned without a public vote. And Howard knew exactly how to turn his family home into a place worth preserving, not for what had been built, but for what had been broken and rebuilt. The foundation he registered wasn't even in his own name. It was named after Ruth, his late wife. The woman who held that family together when Howard was too tired, too bitter, too crushed beneath layoffs and pinched pensions to notice the kids were slipping. He built the foundation in her name, not out of romance, but as a reminder. The children had forgotten her, used her name in toasts, but not in decisions, quoted her recipes, but mocked her values. Howard remembered. And when the official plaque was installed at the community center's entrance, it read, "The Ruth Harper Home for Those Left Behind." The final legal blow came 6 weeks before the children returned. A single letter, certified, time-stamped, notarized. Delivered to the county clerk, the care facility, the family's shared financial institution, and the town historical board. Subject: formal revocation of consent regarding care relocation and family financial delegation. Howard never signed their form. He had pretended to sign it during that Christmas dinner. Smiled, nodded, even used a pen. But it was a duplicate copy. Blank on the back. Switched beneath the table when Sarah spilled the wine on her blouse and Ethan bent down to help. A perfect, silent exchange. No one ever noticed. The care facility had prepared a room. Howard never showed up. Instead, he left town quietly, on foot, 2 days later. Rented a room above a bakery in a neighboring village, paid cash, used a name from a childhood storybook. He didn't need much. Just space, silence, and time to build something bigger than a grudge. When the family finally returned, months later, after hearing he must have passed by now, they arrived to locked gates, no keys, and a smiling volunteer who handed them a pamphlet and said, "Welcome. We're so glad to have you." They were never mentioned in the archive room. No family tree, no tribute wall, no photo memories. They were, officially and irrevocably, guests. Strangers in the house they once called home. And that's how Howard wanted it. The notice came by mail. Thick cream paper, gold-embossed lettering addressed formally. To the surviving children of Howard Eli Briggs. Subject: estate finalization and asset disposition. Notification of public proceedings. It was signed by a law office none of them recognized. Inside, the language was dense, cold, clinical. But the summary was clear. As Mr. Briggs did not pass under private guardianship, and as no surviving spouse or designated heirs remain eligible, all liquidated assets, by his prior directive, will be handled via sealed auction to fund the continuation of the Ruth Harper home for those left behind. There was no mention of a will, no mention of Sarah, Ethan, or Claire. No inheritance. Just a time, date, and location for the auction. The children were furious. Ethan called the county, demanding answers. Claire tried to contact the original notary, Carl Bennett, but he wouldn't return her calls. Sarah reached out to the community center board, asking how to reverse a misfiled foundation deed. They were met with silence or polite rejection. Everything had been filed perfectly. The day of the auction was overcast and quiet. 3 families sat in the small town hall lobby. A young couple with a child, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, flanked by nurses, and one man in a dark coat, alone, seated in the back corner with a thermos and notebook. The children entered, confused. No one else looked like competition. A clerk handed them bidding slips and instructions. Sealed bids only, all sales final, no exceptions. "What exactly is being sold?" Sarah snapped. "What remains," the woman said softly, "but I wouldn't get your hopes up." Back at the house, now the Ruth Harper home, the rooms were freshly painted. The library had been converted into a grief support space. The old bedroom was now a hospice counseling room. The garden, Howard's pride, had been transformed into a community memorial walk. At the center, a bench. On the bench, a bronze plate that read, "Some homes are meant to be shared, not owned. Some fathers don't shout, they build." They didn't cry right away. Anger came first. Then confusion. Then disbelief. Claire tried the old backdoor key. It didn't fit. Ethan pulled on the garage handle. It was welded shut. No entry, no authority. Just visitors. That night, back at Sarah's hotel, an envelope was waiting at the front desk. Hand-delivered. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Typed. "You gave me a form to sign. I didn't. You told me to step aside. I stepped forward instead. You wanted me gone, so I disappeared. But this land remembers. And now, so will others. I hope one day, when you walk through that community garden, you'll sit on that bench and remember not the man you dismissed, but the man who made it all possible. I was never angry, just disappointed. Take care of yourselves." Howard, that was the last they ever heard from him. No funeral. No obituary. No grave. Only stories, passed quietly from volunteer to visitor, from counselor to patient. Stories of a man who loved too deeply, was hurt too silently, and rebuilt his legacy not with rage, but with purpose. And now, every Christmas, the Ruth Harper home lights a single lantern at the garden center. No plaque, no speech. Just light in the cold. And on the donation box by the gate, etched in small cursive, "He didn't shout, he planned." If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching to the end.